Our state, its economic dynamics, and the security of its citizens are affected by the actions of people not just beyond the state's borders, but beyond the borders of our country, by the nations of the world. Among those states, not one is more important than China, the most populous nation in the world. Our first speaker, Professor Jean Garrison, is the University of Wyoming's expert on China and on the United States' diplomatic relationships with it. Her second book, Making China Policy, From Nixon to G.W. Bush, analyzes the dynamics of how recent presidents and their advisors on international affairs interacted to determine the U.S.'s policy towards China, both in terms of overall policy goals and in terms of the reactions to specific events, like, for example, Tiananmen Square. Her third book marked an important shift towards issues important to Wyoming, China and the energy equation in Asia. Subsequent research has focused on issues of energy and energy security, especially as the world's climate begins to undergo significant change. At UW, Jean has brought her knowledge and experience with the international world to our students, from courses introducing students to international relations or the Cold War in Asia, to international relations theory, Chinese, Russian, and U.S. foreign policy, as well as the psychology of war. Dr. Garrison has taught our students about how the U.S. interacts with other big players in the world and how they can understand its impact on us. Jean directed UW's program in Global and Area Studies from 2008 to 2014, and then she founded the Center of Global Studies, which she still heads. During this time, she's been instrumental in giving students opportunities, both to travel abroad and experience international culture, as well as bringing key players in international diplomacy from a variety of countries to UW to interact with our students and faculty. Tonight, Dr. Jean Garrison will speak to us on China-American relations in the Trump era, cooperation, confrontation, or crisis. Jean.
Thanks, Paul. Thank you. So I want to thank everybody who Paul listed and just say it's lovely to be up here in Gillette. It's been a few months since I've been in Gillette, and it's a treat to come and speak about something that I consider the single most important relationship that the United States has, and that is the relationship with China. It's clearly a very thorny relationship. I'd say it's more thorny now than it might have even been a year ago. And part of the reason why, and maybe I better say it's been thorny in particular since 2008, because China is a global player now. There's no way, it is the second leading economy. The United States is the largest economy in the world. Depending on how you count it, though, I would say China will surpass, in terms of GNP numbers, the United States, within the next 3 to 6 years, something like that. It depends on the estimate. Now, that doesn't mean that they're necessarily a threat, but I want to talk about that. I'm going to walk us around the relationship, the nature of the relationship. I put in the title deliberately, with a question mark, cooperation, confrontation, or crisis. And what I would say is it's all three simultaneously, which makes it an extremely complicated relationship. So, in a nutshell, two leading economies in the world, the two leading military powers in the world, two leading greenhouse gas emitters in the world. I say that because I'm going to have a little bit of an energy spin in some of this, and I thought you might want to be queued up to talk about energy a little bit. I think it's really very timely to be talking about China and Gillette. I mean, after all, Gillette, one of Gillette's sister cities is Yulin, China. The notion of what do we do with our coal? Can we export our coal? Is there going to be a market in East Asia for our coal? Whether we can get it out of Washington or not is another question. But that's a thing to point out too, because a lot of policy has as much to do with the domestic context as it does with the international. So I'm going to be walking you through this from a global geopolitical perspective, an economic perspective, and the economic interdependencies that exist between the U.S. and China. I'm going to talk about the domestic context in the U.S. as well as in China. And then I'm going to talk about leadership a little bit and do a little bit of comparison between kind of our leader, President Trump, and also Xi Jinping, who's the current leader of China. So in order to get us started, though, we should probably do a snapshot of U.S.-China relations. So I'm going to go through this really quickly and just say, for the last almost 50 years, And what I'm marking that by is that in 1969, that's when Henry Kissinger started secret trips to China. We started the opening to China, and it's in 1972 under the presidency of Richard Nixon that we have the summit. He travels to Shanghai, he travels to China, and we get the opening to China. And between, during the Cold War, whether you're looking at President Nixon, President Carter, or President Reagan, there's a lot of continuity because there's a shared security threat with the Soviet Union, which the US and China perceive similarly. That's part of the glue of the relationship. And then the tremendous economic opportunity that comes with China and Deng Xiaoping's opening of China, but then opening up toward the market. And that really starts, the early to mid 1980s. And that's a huge opportunity for US business. So until Tiananmen Square, it's an extremely positive, close relationship, which is developing because there's a lot of hope that China is not only reforming economically, maybe they're going to reform politically as well. Tiananmen Square absolutely crushes that thought. So the famous picture you might have seen when you think about the tank man stopping the tank, trying to stop the tank. I think he's actually rolled over by the tank. But that is a clear indication that China is different and it's not going to evolve politically. And we know now, actually, if we look at today, China is more closed now. It's closing back up again ideologically and politically. It's more authoritarian today than it was 5 years ago, and that's partly because of the current leader. But I just want to point out that there have been a lot of shared interests. As China has grown economically, we have become tremendously interdependent. We want to sell our goods, we are their market, and those interdependencies tend to lead to potentials for cooperation and potentials for competition. 9/11, believe it or not, was an opportunity to bring back that shared security interest. And so since 9/11, there's been quite a bit of cooperation on counterterrorism with the Chinese. So that's been an important piece of what's brought the two together. So moving beyond 9/11 and thinking about the current presidents, and I think it's more useful for us to be thinking in terms of comparing President Trump with President Obama and President G.W. Bush. Every presidency that I have looked at in the context of US-Chinese relations has started out very confrontational in their rhetoric vis-a-vis China. Even Bill Clinton did this, and his issue was human rights. And so he was very much, had attacked, been very critical of George H.W. Bush for being too close to China. So it was a human rights issue for President Clinton. For President Bush, it was about the rising China threat and that concern. And then 9/11 happens, and all of a sudden, they can be allies in the context of the war on terror. For President Obama, actually, President Obama had the worst relationship with China over the last decade or decade and a half, and I think that might surprise people. So one of the things I will do in this talk is give you a little bit of context on what Obama did in the context, because as most new presidents, when they come into office, they usually try to refute all the policies of their predecessors if they came from the previous political party. So today, what we have with President Trump is a labeling of China as a great power rival. He did this. His administration did this in December of 2017 in the National Security Strategy. Both Russia and China have been labeled as great power rivals. Now I'm saying that a couple of times because it's critically important, because it poses the question that I have for us in our talk this evening. So these are the key questions for the talk. Will the era of US-China relations currently be as dangerous as the Cold War US-Soviet competition? What is the nature of the security dilemma between the United States and China? And this is very much, if you've ever taken an international relations course, you know this is a key concept in political science. This is the sense that in a world where there is no trust, anarchy, anarchical world, there's no overarching world government to kind of bring order to the world, that every country is out there on their own. And in a context where you have rising mistrust, you have a situation where the behavior of the other is perceived as a threat. This is the land, this is the the situation involving arms races. That classic arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union would be a good example of that. So I'm posing that as a question for us. If, as President Trump has posed, China is a great power rival, is this then a situation which is like the emerging days of a new Cold War? So that's what I want us to think about. And I'm going to walk us through a few perspectives on that. I'm going to look at it from the perspective of hard power, military power, from the perspective of economic interdependence, and then also soft power, the persuasion ability of a country, the sense of, what is the attractiveness of a country. Keep in mind that when we talk about the bilateral relationship between the United States and China, there's a global context to it, and there's certainly an East Asia context to it. So I'm going to spend quite a bit of time putting it in the context of our allies and the whole East Asia, Southeast Asia situation. So here's our question. Is China's success a threat? So having said that, are we destined to be economic and geopolitical rivals? Is it predetermined that this is what we're going to see? How we look at this, how we view the situation, not surprisingly, depends on kind of where we start from. So the bookends in international relations, in terms of the worldviews or the perspectives, the lenses through which we might interpret the nature of the Chinese threat, if it is a threat, we can think of it in terms of two bookends. One is the neoliberal complex interdependence perspective. On the other side, we have pessimistic realism. So will China, if you're neoliberal, will China follow a model of economic and political openness? Will it join the existing international order and prosper? It is certainly prospering. And there have been aspects for every president since Richard Nixon to encourage China to become part of the global order. This is a sense that China opens up, becomes a trading nation, joins the WTO, plays by the rules, so to speak. Plays by the rules of the international political system as designed, after all, by the United States since World War II. On the pessimistic side, this is the prediction from realism and pessimistic realpolitik that the prediction of intense competition, China's growing strength, will lead it to become more assertive, which will lead the United States to balance against it. So this would be hedging. So what do we mean by hedging? In this context, think about the treaty allies that we have in East Asia. We have troops in Japan. We have troops in South Korea. We have arrangements in Australia. We have basings and ability to port agreements in places like Singapore. So we have actually a thread of military installations and agreements all the way around the edge of China. And it's part of the way that we manage that sense that, well, maybe we can't completely trust China. So there's a long, that's a 70-year commitment on the part of the United States. So if you're China and you have that as part of your reality, that's part of your geopolitical reality. So I wanted us to start with a map. Okay, this is a map which includes, now this is about 5 years old, so some of the pipelines here that are dotted have actually been completed. But I wanted to show you energy because after all, China is, really is growing faster than any other country in the world. What's significant here is to point out that if you're growing really fast, you're really hungry for energy. So actually the need for energy is a vulnerability from the perspective of China. They have an engine, they're growing fast, but to feed that engine, they need natural gas imports, they need oil imports, they need everything. So they need to build those coal-fired power plants. They need those renewables, and they are investing tremendously in all of those areas. If you are Xi Jinping, or if you are a commander in the People's Liberation Army, think about what you have to deal with. And I don't know how much you know about Chinese history, but if we just go around, let's go around a circle for a minute. So we've got, in the context on what would be their east coast, here we have North Korea. That's a fun spot. That's a fun country to have as your neighbor. We've got South Korea, where we have US troops. We've got Japan. Remember, South Korea and Japan are treaty allies for the United States. Then you keep going around. Then across the top, you've got Russia, historic animosity between the Chinese and the Russians. You go around and get to Kazakhstan, and you have then a whole border where your Uyghur population, your Muslim population, which are in many cases seek to be separate, you see them as a threat and you're worried about that. So that's not it's not stable. You go around, you have ongoing disputes on borders with India. You have challenges with Burma. You have historic rivalry with Vietnam. So you actually have, if you think about it, it's not a safe neighborhood to you, and so you already have a sense of insecurity. You also have a sense of privilege because this isn't China's rise. This is China coming back onto the political scene. After all, if you go back 150 years, China was the leading economy of the world. So you're thinking this is a perspective of 2,500 years and even longer for being the middle power. So in a sense, China has a sense of position and place, and they see themselves as coming back onto the world stage, and they should be respected as the power that they are. So this is only part of the equation. What about if we think about Southeast Asia? Okay, China is a trading nation. 60% of trade in the world goes through the Malacca Straits and through the South China Sea. If you are Taiwan, China, South Korea and Japan, which you can't see on this map, which are also trading nations, the majority of your natural gas and oil come through here as well. So that is then what a sense of vulnerability that you have. And if you think about it, if you can see the Straits of Malacca, which if I can do the pointer here correctly, whoops, that didn't work. There we go. I won't do it. It's true. The what? Oh, okay. Straits of Malacca right here. A couple of terrorists sinking a couple of ships, and you would block that. If you block the Straits of Malacca, at its narrowest point, it's about 1.5 kilometers wide. If you block that, you have to go an extra 900 miles all the way around. So think of the price tag for your trade and for your energy. So this is an interesting thing to think about because here is a sense of vulnerability. If you're China, it's also a shared sense of vulnerability if you're Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan. So there's a shared interest there. The United States guarantees the sea lanes in this area. It's one of the reasons why we have such a presence in this area because, of course, we are guaranteeing those sea lanes for our allies as well. But as China more and more mistrusts the United States, it doesn't see the U.S. presence, the U.S. naval presence, as a plus. They see it as a challenge. As a matter of fact, this then leads them to invest in a blue water navy, aircraft carriers, so that they can project into this area as well. So this is their highway. This is their lifeline. And it is something that as they get more and more influential, certainly they are investing very heavily in this area. As a matter of fact, one of the major policies, foreign policies right now is the Belt and Road program, and that is major investment. And that's really been going on for 20 years in Southeast Asia. That is major investment in infrastructure, it's roads, it's railroads. There's a big railroad going down into Burma, dams, and this is actually not just into Southeast Asia, it's all the way to Europe. So one of the goals of the current regime in China is to make this an area of growth which can actually challenge the transatlantic zone. So I wanted to give you a sense of just thinking about how they might see their neighborhood and why they might be feeling a little bit insecure. I think it's very valuable for us to be able to sit in the shoes of the other in order to think about how they might react to the sorts of things we do. Okay, moving forward. It's got 3 cartoons for you, which kind of give you a sense of how we might see it. Now this might be, if we're looking at this from a US perspective, this is not terribly comforting. This is a sense of China, the big dragon, coming to the table. They're equal at the table. They've crushed the chair, and they're really big. And the American eagle is overwhelmed. Here's another one, which has a sense of, which gets at a sense of the economics of the relationship vis-a-vis China. China owns 25% of the US debt that is held by foreign countries. And that's about $1.75 trillion. Now, a lot of times people will think, well, what if the Chinese stop investing or call those notes? Well, I just want to point out that do keep in mind, from an economic interdependence perspective, China does want us to buy their goods. So this is a sense of shared vulnerability here. You know, they want us to buy their goods, and yet they hold our debt. And they are extremely wealthy. They're the wealthiest country in the world, and we are swimming in debt. When you have this much wealth, you are able to project power and do things. We have to sit and have conversations about whether we think we can afford to do things. So that's a very different perspective and position to be in. One more cartoon for you, thinking in terms of trade and the uneven trade. This is a sense of being just, you know, dumped on with Chinese goods. When you look at imports versus exports, China brings into this country about 4 times what we send to China. So it's very unbalanced. And this is something that's been a major issue for President Trump and the last 4 or 5 US presidents, as a matter of fact. Okay, so is there a US-China security dilemma? Clearly, we've got a context for concern. We've got a sense of we are in bed in a relationship with a country. We're not sure the direction they're going. We have a sense of vulnerability, a sense of shared vulnerability. There's a few ways that we can begin to measure the nature of this security dilemma. There's a sense of, in the context of a sense of mistrust, when you have a spiral of fear and arming. Well, we have this. We have rapid modernization of Chinese nuclear forces. China's investing heavily in conventional forces as well as nuclear. The US has a continued alliance with Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, which very much concerns China. And of course, we have the recent call by President Trump to increase our investment and upgrade our own nuclear forces. So the intensity of the security dilemma will depend on your beliefs about the other's motives, what their goals are, and how much you feel vulnerable. So I want to walk us through some spending that we have going on in the context of military on both sides. Here we have data showing US spending across from the Truman administration all the way through Obama. So this is a Cold War average of $458 billion. I don't have President Trump on this, but I can tell you that the 2019 request is $719 billion. So it's going up. Okay, so this is what the US is doing for a global presence, a continued 70-year global presence. This is what China is doing. So here in 2014 dollars, you have this rise in military spending, and right now it's about $200 billion a year. Here's the comparison. So the United States spends more on its military, and these are 2016 data. Okay, so you have to take the next 7 countries combined to get close to the United States. Now, from the perspective of the US, that might give us a feeling of security. We're outspending, even outspending our rival 3-to-1. If you are one of the other countries and you're not feeling secure about US behavior, they're gonna use this for domestic context for their own spending. And that is precisely what goes on. So here you have a sense, if you're China looking at US spending, you're saying they're doing 3-to-1, they've been doing it for 70 years, and that would be, for those who see the United States as a threat, that gives them room to argue for greater spending. And certainly there are those voices in the security arena in China, particularly in the People's Liberation Army. Here's the economic numbers I pointed out. This shows trade. And here you have the United States numbers in yellow, and in orange you have Chinese numbers, and that shows that huge trade imbalance that we were talking about. Okay, here's a real map of it. I don't want you to look at the details. I bring this picture to you because I just want to show you that these are 2 trading nations. Both the United States and China are very much dependent on trade. It shows the same kind of imbalance in terms of the little line coming from the US over to China and the thicker line going from China over to the US. But it just goes to show that there's a lot of interdependencies in the context of what we sell, they buy, and vice versa. Okay, so where does this leave us? How are you feeling? Are you feeling confident in this relationship? Here's where the American public is from the fall data from the Pew Global Attitudes Survey. So it's a very divided view of China. And this has gone up and down over time, but what you see here is that there's a higher unfavorable view of China than a favorable view. As a matter of fact, if you use the same data looking at whether China is perceived as a threat, about 46% of Americans see China as a threat, as a major threat currently. And by the way, this is one of the few bipartisan issues. The numbers, if you break it down by party, are 48% for Republicans and 43% for Democrats. So there's not a lot of difference there. The other one where you don't see difference is actually on North Korea. About 75% of Americans see North Korea as a major threat. So I'm going to walk you through some global data, some from the perspective of the US, some showing how the Chinese view the US, and some showing how the globe either view the US and or China. So, US and Chinese views of the future. Who's going to be the leading power moving forward? When you look at the top line, what you see is that in the United States, almost half the people think that China has already or will replace the United States as the global power. Okay, so I interpret that as a sense of uncertainty on the role of the United States in the world. And these are 2015 data. If you look at Chinese polls, what you see is greater confidence in their future. Let me just say that as of about 2015 in the polling data, you also see 53% of Americans saying, I don't want to be the world's leading power. So there's beginning to be a questioning of whether they want to be there as well. Global views, or views of global leading economic power. I wanted to point out on this, look, red is China, blue is seeing the United States as a future, kind of current and future economic power. It's very interesting to see that the Europeans are saying, along with the Russians, that the Chinese are the leading economic power. It's India, Japan, South Korea, some of our allies in Southeast Asia that are saying, no, it's the United States. Okay, so now I'm bringing the data up to right now. One of the things that I noticed when I was putting this talk together, I was very interested in getting the most current data I could find. And so because this is a discussion, a very current discussion on the nature of our current president and our current situation vis-a-vis China, where is the United States now vis-a-vis a year ago? And what you see in these data is a declining confidence in the United States over the last year, and you see a gap between the way the globe was viewing where Obama was at the end of his administration versus confidence in the United States at the start of the Trump administration. So we can talk about why that might be the case, but it's pretty striking. Keep in mind that when Obama got elected, he was very popular around the world, so you saw a jump going the other way too, between George W. Bush and Obama. So Obama tended to be quite popular globally. Here are some favorability ratings. Oops, back. And you have to squint a little bit to read this, but what you really see here is that depending on the countries that you're focusing on, and it's in the middle that you get Japan, for example, but you see anywhere from Sweden, which is a drop by 83 points in terms of favorability, and this is based on then global views of our current president. Now in a minute, we can have a conversation about does that really matter? But it's striking from the perspective of soft power, the power of attraction, the power of persuasion, that you have this kind of drop. Okay, US vis-a-vis China and Russia. What strikes me about these data is you have a situation where the US edge on favorability around the globe, and this is data from 37 different countries from across the globe, and you have that gap shrinking between the United States and China, and even Russia is increasing. I don't really have a good explanation for that other than it might be the attraction of a kind of a strong leader That might be something. Favorability of the US and China compared by country. And I want you in these next data just to look at Asia. So I circled it so you could think about Asia. What we see here is that Australia and Indonesia have higher favorabilities for China. But the other countries, India, Philippines, South Korea, Japan, and Vietnam, very much have a situation which is the opposite. Now, one of the things that's very striking is, why is Australia so favorable toward China? Well, who really sells them coal? Who sells them energy and minerals and raw materials? It's really the market for Australia. It really is China. Another demonstration. These are data comparing the viewpoint on the current leader of China, Xi Jinping, and confidence levels in President Trump worldwide. And again, and here the next one I've circled Asia for you. Look at these data. What you see here in these data is actually mixed for both views of Xi Jinping and President Trump. But some of them are, no confidence with President Trump in some of our treaty allies. South Korea, look at the numbers for Japan, 78 and 72%. 70 for Australia. Indonesia, 67%. And then it flips a little bit with the Philippines and India. And then if you look over on the Xi Jinping side, maybe this will make us feel a little bit better. There's like low confidence in him as well. So if you are China's neighbor, think about it for a minute. So China is the leading recipient of direct foreign investment in the world. It's the engine of growth for the region. This is an area that, because of the American investment, because of American military presence bringing 70 years of stability, this has been a zone of economic prosperity for years. And China has been the engine for the last 30 years. And so all that investment that comes into China, it bleeds out and it brings money and opportunity to countries around Southeast Asian countries. So what you see across the data that I'm going to show you here in a minute is mixed views of China. They need China for their economic prosperity. They're worried about China's growing assertiveness in the region. And we see that in the viewpoint of their view of China's investment in military. Remember, earlier in the talk, we looked at how much China's investment in its military is going up. Well, look at South Korea. 93% of the people think it's a bad thing. Japan, 90% think it's a bad thing. Vietnam, 90% see it as a bad thing. Philippines, bad thing. India, 56%. Indonesia, even Indonesia sees it as a bad thing. What about China as an economic engine? You get a reversal. Here you have a situation where there are some mixed views, but it is much more positive than the worries about their military investment. Australia, 70% perceive China's growing economy as a good thing. Japan, 53% see it as a good thing. And then the numbers again, it's less than 50%, but it's positive in the context of Indonesia, the Philippines, and South Korea. The leading economic relationship for South Korea, after all, is China. So the countries in the region, their leading economic trade partners, not the United States, it's China. So there's that sense of, there's shared interest, there's some vulnerability, but there's a recognition that they need China. One of the things that I came across when I was working on China policy, I was in the State Department for a few months during the George W. Bush administration, and one of the things that people would tell you, diplomats from this region would tell you, is don't make us choose. And what they meant by that is, don't make us choose between China and the United States, because of how much they need China for their own economic prosperity. So there is something, especially when we're looking at Japan because of the East China Sea, when we look at the Philippines and Vietnam, there are a lot of territorial disputes in the South China Sea, and that is one area that really has ramped up the concerns for countries in the region vis-a-vis China. When you look at the territorial disputes between the Philippines, Japan, Vietnam, and China, you can see that in the Philippines, 56% of people are very concerned. If you total it up, 91% are very concerned. So I don't know to what degree you watch what goes on in the South China Sea, but remember, we talked about how 60% of global trade goes through the South China Sea. Much of the energy goes through the South China Sea. Here's a representation of the trade, or excuse me, of the territorial disputes. The red line is what China claims. The blue line is what Vietnam claims, and then there are others mixed in. Why are they so worried about what's going on here? Well, there's just huge estimates for oil and gas reserves, and this is a huge fishing ground as well. And what has China been doing? This is what they've been doing. Now, this is a representation, pictures taken between March of 2014 and January of 15, and it's even more so today. They've been taking these shoals and these rocks, dredging, essentially creating islands and building bases. Okay, so let's get to the policy piece, which is probably what you're most interested in. China has become very assertive since 2008. 2008 is a marker because this is the financial crisis. The Chinese call the 2008 financial crisis the American-made crisis. And it is a turning point for them because they recovered very quickly. It gave them a sense of Chinese triumph, of Western weakness, and they were able to be in a position to promote their interests more aggressively. And at the same time, of course, China is a comprehensive national power. I mean, it has a large military, a growing military. It has a growing economy. It invests in its area, in its region, and it is seen as a very important source of development aid to many countries in the region. Xi Jinping, when he became premier, consolidated his power very quickly. One of the things that struck me in visiting China in recent years is, some of the freedoms that that occurred in terms of press freedoms and some of the freedoms of association. Some of those have been constricted. So some of this, the ability of civil society to act in China has narrowed. I want to point out that when China, or when the Communist Party feels insecure, when it has this external context of concern for what's going on, they tend to clamp up. The other thing that's been going on in China, although you have 7% growth, I mean, wouldn't we love to have even 5% growth here in the United States? 7% growth is not the 10% growth average that you had over 30 years. So their economy has challenges as well, and this is something that makes the Communist Party feel insecure. I would say that Xi Jinping increasingly he's as powerful a leader. Okay, he's as powerful a leader as we've had since Premier Mao, and he's consolidated his power, and he has become, he and his foreign policy group have become much more assertive in the region. So now we're back to our original question. Are the U.S. and China trapped in a rivalry? Keep in mind that when we look at President Trump's foreign policy in Asia, we have to think about what he inherited. What he inherited from President Obama was a turn or a pivot to Asia. Following the Bush administration, the United States started to be invited back into Asia. And President Obama took advantage of that, started investing back again in relationship building between India all the way around to Japan, and trying to pivot U.S. foreign policy attention to Asia. This did not make him popular in China. But what he pursued was a two-pronged strategy which had been very much the policy of the previous presidents all the way since Nixon, both engagement with China and hedging against the potential threat that China represented. So U.S. policy has had both engagement, generally economic engagement, but also investing in allies. President Trump, very different approach in some ways rhetorically, very hardline rhetoric during the campaign. By the way, again, that is pretty typical. He promised to label China a currency manipulator, promised to respond to its theft of American trade secrets and unfair subsidy behavior, took that phone call from the leader of Taiwan. Remember, the basis of the relationship between the United States and China is the one China policy. And what that means is that the United States only recognizes one China. There are very deep unofficial relations and security guarantees with Taiwan, but there's only one China, and that is the bedrock of this relationship. And one of the things that President Trump did was call into question this adherence to the one China policy. So he backtracked on some early policy positions, and he got lambasted, by some of the foreign policy establishment for doing that. President Trump has a very different kind of approach and style. He has a nationalist, American first kind of a position. He also has a transactional foreign policy approach. And what that means is that this is the art of the deal piece of President Trump. This is the sense that if he can make a deal on something, he might. If he makes a deal on something, it makes him a little bit unpredictable. So what's been going on with the Olympics currently, kind of this shift, very quick shift saying, oh, it's okay to talk with North Korea. If there's a deal to be made, President Trump might do that. And that's different than a president that's locked into, very much a status quo approach to China. So that's something very interesting to watch. I can speak a little bit more, later on, if you'd like, in the Q&A. If you're interested in knowing a little bit more about who makes foreign policy in the Trump administration on China, I'd be very happy to talk about that. I've already mentioned that we have a very hard-line position following the national security strategy, seeing China as a great power rival. So I just wanted to end with the question we started with then. Is China's success a threat? Well, if we wanted to boil it down, it really depends on your worldview. It depends on how you interpret those aspects of what's going on in military spending on both sides, the nature of the economic interdependence that's going on, and then the nature of kind of the soft power relationships and where you sit. Do you sit from a more optimistic perspective of a neo-realist, or do you sit from the perspective of a realist or a pessimistic realist? And depending on where you sit, you're going to interpret those numbers very, very differently. The thing I would say that we absolutely need to do is I think we need to make sure that we decrease the uncertainty that our allies feel, because another piece of the President Trump's policies and statements when he was campaigning, it was, well, those allies, they're not paying their way. Why do we need these alliances? That creates uncertainty with the Japanese and the U.S., between the Koreans and the U.S., pull out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was that trade deal that was going to involve 12 countries, around the Pacific. Pulling out of that created space for China to move in. So maybe we can talk a little bit about that. But what I would really say is, from my perspective and my take on the situation, we need to manage this complicated relationship. We need to recognize that it has elements of confrontation, cooperation, and crisis. And I just say we need to stay in the game. Thank you. I'd love questions, particularly if you think I didn't get to say something because I had to bounce through it. Yes?
I had a couple. First off, do you think China's actions in the South China Sea are kind of indicative of how its behavior would grow if it were to increase in economic and military might? Kind of the first tremors of flexing its muscles, so to speak?
Yeah. I see no reason why they would change in that regard. And I say that because, actually there's a famous statement on the part of the foreign minister of China in 2010. He was asked this question, why? Why have you gone from trying to reassure your neighbors to behaving in such a way that they feel threatened? And he essentially answered by saying, well, we're big and they're small, because they can. Now, having said that, whether that is perceived as an attempt to bring order, maybe they could be seen as the guarantor of those sea lanes. But, I would say that I don't think it has helped China's position to make their neighbors nervous. They're less worried about it because they're in a much stronger position vis-a-vis their neighbors than they were even a decade ago.
Thank you, Dr. Garrison. And my second question is, do you have any hard numbers when you talk about them building up a blue water
Yeah.
Navy? I was curious, especially as it relates to aircraft carriers, and I know in the past the U.S. has dominated when it comes to aircraft carriers in the global scene.
Yeah. So, I mean, you know, I was Googling this stuff to try to be able to answer specific questions like that. So most recently what they've been trying to do is retrofit some old Ukrainian aircraft carriers. So I think they've got 1 or 2 now. Keep in mind that they see, I'm going to turn that question on its head a little bit, they see Taiwan as a permanent aircraft carrier for the United States right off their shore. You know, so I think the way I'd answer your question is they're going to continue to invest. So I've been watching China for 20 years. And when I put this talk together, I had to change the way I would talk about some things because they've become much more assertive than they have been in the past. I don't have the exact numbers for you, but you know what? Shoring up those shoals and those rocks, that's as good as any aircraft carrier in the South China Sea, because you've got submarine basing and you have the ability to project in there. So they're doing a number of things. Now, having said that then, though, I think an insecure China is not in the best interest of the United States, because an insecure China leads to this kind of behavior that your question posed, which is more and more assertive behavior. So I think it's a representation of their sense of insecurity, and they feel it. And I think it's felt more by the current leadership than it had been in the previous leadership. Yes?
We read frequently about China being the key to denuclearizing North Korea. What's your opinion on that?
My opinion on that is that this is one of those issues that is a demonstration of what we can't and can't do. And what I mean by that is that there's no way to bomb. There's no military solution to North Korea because of where things are. And keep in mind, if something gets triggered there, you might get as many as 1 million or more South Koreans killed. The prosperity of that area is, it's gone. So in other words, it's not in anybody's interest to have that come to a fight. And having said that, from a Chinese perspective, the Chinese perspective isn't the same as the U.S. perspective. I mean, there's a sense of course, it's the only ally North Korea has. So there's that sense of responsibility there. They don't want refugees flooding from North Korea into China. So there's that concern. So there's a credibility concern. There's a refugee concern. And they are not moving on that. And so where does that leave the United States? Recognizing that there's going to be a nuclear North Korea. I think that's the reality. Frankly, it already exists. So having said that then, how do you manage that kind of an issue? How do you live with that? That is not an easy thing for American citizens and American leaders. But I think that's the reality that we're going to see. So then it's about managing the relationship versus trying to solve it. It's not a particularly solvable issue. Maybe the one thing you could do, I'm not sure, if you could guarantee the survival of the regime and the regime believed that might bring them to the table. So we'll see. But here's something that's very interesting about President Trump. President Trump really doesn't have any deep-seated foreign policy beliefs. He's willing to make a deal. So in that sense, he might be more willing to make a deal, a radical deal, than any other potential president. So it's unpredictable. It's interesting. Yes?
Maybe I missed it earlier, but where are the majority of the petroleum imports coming from into China?
Middle East. And part of the answer is anywhere they can get it. But they are the number one. Saudi Arabia is their number one source currently. So they have some of the same vulnerabilities that we think of in terms of when we've been very much tied to resources from the Middle East. They have some of the same thing. But having said that, okay, they will import from Russia. They have pipelines coming in from Kazakhstan. They'll get it from wherever they can, but the Middle East has become increasingly important, which then, of course, from a U.S. perspective, makes people nervous because it means that they're meddling around in the Middle East. Paul, do I have a minute to make one comment about who's making policy? So I truncated this a little bit. There is no foreign policy machine in place in the Trump administration. Every president in the last 3 presidencies has gotten slower and slower to nominate people into positions. When you don't nominate your own people into positions such as in the State Department, usually China policy is coordinated with the Assistant Secretary for East Asian and Pacific Affairs. There's nobody in that position currently. So instead, policy is being dictated out of the White House. Now that's also not necessarily terribly unusual, but usually you'll have those China hands at the desk. They're not at the desk. They're not in the meetings. At least in the first 6 months, Jared Kushner was the one coordinating US-China policy. Now, that's changed because there was some concern about being a little bit too close to the Chinese ambassador. As a matter of fact, it was Henry Kissinger who introduced the Chinese ambassador to Jared Kushner because, you know, the Chinese had no window into the Trump administration, you know, nobody to really connect to. So there were some concerns about what did that relationship look like. So I'm an advocate for having the experts at the table along with people in the administration. The other thing I would say from the perspective of any president, you want your own people in position because then, you know, they're watching the store, right? They're watching the shop as well, and they're there in those bureaucratic positions to advocate for your policies, for the president's policies. And that's a concern, and it's actually a weakness from the perspective of the current president. You want your people in position to advocate for your policy positions. And that's not something that's really occurred across a number of key policy areas. We'll see what happens in the next 6 months or so.
And are most of those positions, do they have to be confirmed by the
Yes, they do. These are political appointee positions I'm talking about. The other thing that's happened is, I mean, after all, President Trump was not the most popular candidate in the context of the Republican Party as well. So there's a whole level of foreign policy people on the Republican side who have actually refused to take positions. So that has limited the pool that he might go to as well. But you know, he is also very much, you know, really wants a very tight circle around, and they do a lot of things out of the White House. And you know, we haven't had a real test of his system yet. There hasn't been a real crisis yet. There usually is, you know, something will come along, and we'll see what happens. But in general, you know, presidents, they weather that first crisis and then they shift. So we'll see what happens with our current president. Thank you very much.